I'm really excited about this conversation. This is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a long time, and I'd like to say that the reason I'm here is because I used to be a designer, and then I went into theatre criticism, and I've just recently completed a PhD that uses theatre reviews to look at scenography. But that would be a lie. I think I'm mainly here because Tom enjoys my rants on Twitter about this, so that's the honest reason. I'm really excited about the critics and designers we've got here to talk about some of these subjects tonight. To my left, we've got Bridget Minamore. Bridget Minamore is a British Ghanaian writer from South East London. She is a poet, critic, essayist and journalist, often writing about pop culture, theatre, race and class for The Guardian and The Stage. She is the co-founder of Critics of Colour, a collective that aims to make theatre criticism more representative when it comes to the voices of people of colour. And next to Bridget we have Susannah Clapp. Susannah Clapp has been a theatre critic of The Observer since 1997. She was the theatre critic of Radio 3's Nightwaves from 1994 to 2013, and as the New Statesman from 1996 to 1997. She has worked as a publisher's reader and editor at Jonathan Cape, and as the radio critic for the Sunday Times. She helped to found the London Review of Books, where she was assistant editor for 13 years. As a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, she is the literary executor of Bruce Chatwin and Angela Carter, and is the author of books about both writers, with Chatwin from Vintage and A Card from Angela Carter, Bloomsbury. And next to Susannah, we've got Joanna Scotcher. It sounds like I'm about to introduce you to go on a game show the way I'm doing.
I know, I feel like we're about to look on, so repeat.
Joanna is an award-winning designer living in London, working as a creative internationally. She received the What's on Stage Best Set Designer for The Railway Children, which won the Livy Award for Best Entertainment. Having trained at the RSC, she developed a unique path through the live arts and theatre industry. Her work specialises in creating unique and extraordinary experiences, inhabiting spaces from the intimate to the epic. Joanna's diverse output includes commissions by the RSC, Old Vic, Channel 4 Arts, Royal Historic Palaces, Covent Garden, European Olympics and UNICEF. Recent work includes productions at the Young Vic, Royal Court, Manchester Royal Exchange, Shakespeare's Globe and the Abbey Theatre Dublin. And then finally we've got designer Max Dorey. Max trained at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School following a degree in English literature and theatre studies at Leeds University, where he first developed an interest in design and puppetry. He was Leverhulme Trust trainee designer at the RSC and a Limbury Prize finalist. He is graduate representative of the Society of British Theatre Designers and is working to develop tools for graduate and early year designers. He was nominated for Best Set Design in the Off West End Awards 8 times and was a nominee for Best Set Design for the UK Theatre Awards in 2015, just the one time for
just one.
Recent design credits include Chasing Bono at Soho Theatre, Teddy at the Vaults, Julius Caesar, First Encounters for the Royal Shakespeare Company, Schools Tour, 2 for the Seesaw, Trafalgar, Talk Radio at Old Red Lion, The End of Hope at Soho Theatre, The Collector at the Vaults, Cargo at Arcola Theatre, Last of the Boys at Southwark Playhouse, Pyongyang at Finborough Theatre, No Villain at Trafalgar Studios, All the Little Lights at Fifth Word, and then come the Nightjars at Theatre 503, Orson Shadow at Southwark Playhouse, Lardo at Old Red Lion, Collaterally at Finborough Theatre, Sleight of Hand at Edinburgh Fringe, I Can Hear You and This Is Not an Exit at RSC and Royal Court Upstairs, and Black Jesus at Finborough Theatre.
You didn't have to do all of those.
I asked you for an abridged one, this is what you gave me.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'd really like to do first is just start with the most basic question, and Bridget, if I can come to you first. What do you see as the role of the designer?
The role of the designer, well, how many designers in the room? Maybe I should ask first. For me, on a personal level, as someone who fell in love in a big way with theatre a decade ago, the role of the designer is to get me to that place more than anyone else, I'd argue. And I say that only because for me, that's usually how I fall in love with something. I think it looks incredible, and then I feel like my mind is opened up enough to really listen and to the words and to really see the actors, not just looking at them, but to see what they're doing. Maybe I'll leave that there. But I think it's to allow me the space in my head to be able to see everything else and to really understand what else is going on. And I think if a lot of the time, if the design isn't something I'm immediately caught with in some way, I find it so much more difficult to get everything else. And that isn't necessarily the fault of the designer. A lot of the time that's, some things are blocking that, but I feel like a great design will make me sort of gloss over a script or so many other things. I'm like, it looked great, and I'll just go from there.
What about you, Susannah? Can a good design make up for a terrible script?
Well, sometimes it is the only thing that you're there for. I mean, I think theatre is very interesting to write about somebody who comes from a literary background, as I do, because it's a portmanteau experience. So that sometimes, yes, the script can be terrible, or the acting might not be so hot, but there's generally something to watch. There are limitations on that, because actually, of course, if one's so conscious of the design that it's not actually in service to anything else, then that seems to me a mistake. Obviously, of the other derelict propositions in the piece, but also of the design themselves, if one is so conscious of it. Some of the designs that I have been most transported by have been barely visible. I remember having this conversation actually about one of the best designers we have in the country, in my view, on the Evening Standard Awards. This is not the story I was going to tell, but and putting forward his name as a contender for best designer, and another critic on the panel saying, no, we couldn't possibly have him, we can't see what he does. That seemed to me the best argument for him.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot in that. I think that there is a sort of, I think the designer has the responsibility of almost creating the canvas, and a suitable canvas, as you said, that sort of almost opens the door to the show. It sort of sets the emotional scene as well as the physical. And I think sometimes that is almost sort of indecipherable from what's happening on stage, and that's sort of a beautiful synthesis you can get. And then sometimes it's about really supporting storytelling by allowing a huge concept to be addressed very quickly, and then letting the sort of players play it out. So there's sort of different, I think a designer you can take either of those roles, and I think that's the sort of collaborative dialogue that you have with the director and the other creatives about sort of at which pitch you aim that design to support what else is going on in the production, I think.
Yeah, I think because as a designer, one of the things that always interested me most is that you sort of get to wear lots of different hats. And I first came to design through very practical, I through acting, and then doing stage management, then doing set construction, then doing lots of very hands-on things. And I found that every time I sort of thought I might specialise in one thing, I thought, oh, lighting is actually very interesting, maybe I'll go into lighting, what have you. I sort of found myself coming back to in favour of, I knew I couldn't be a director because I can't direct people in the same way, the conversations that directors have and the understanding of the text and that interplay with the actors, but I knew I could direct stuff, and I knew that I could have that sense of being over the entire project, having a sense of aesthetics and those sorts of things. So there's a real kind of Venn diagram of all these different areas that cross in the centre, and that you get to sort of play with all these different bits and pieces. So, I mean, I never know what it is that I'm doing. As I'm doing it, it just sort of feels kind of natural. So in terms of where that comes in with people writing about theatre and criticism, it's as illuminating for me to realise what it is that we've actually been doing this time, when we didn't really plan it from the start per se, it just didn't felt natural.
And I say it was interesting what you were talking about, the two different aspects, and there's almost a third, isn't there? That sometimes the design can actually argue with what you're hearing on stage. Something, and in that sense, it is a collaboration, but it's quite a nuanced and complicated one. Yeah. And of course, take you immediately into it. I mean, we were talking when we were waiting to come out here about a designer that interests me very much. I don't know how to pronounce her second name. Rosie Elnida, is she called? Thank you. Anyway, I saw her latest work, I think, of the Wolves at Stratford East earlier this week. And the interesting thing about that was it both immediately took you into the arena, which is, it's a girls' soccer. Indoor soccer team. So and it's fantastically well choreographed. So these creatures come on absolutely vibrant, as if they've jumped off a Greek vase, sort of spiky, warrior-like. And so they are absolutely full of their own energy, joy, expressiveness, independence. At the same time, there is a limitation on that, which is that they're all from fairly privileged mid-American homes. And they're playing indoors, not outdoors. And what her design gives you is it's played almost as if in a giant duvet. a pale green cushioned space. So on the one hand, it's liberating for them, but on the other hand, it's also saying, actually, they're not quite as much out there as they think they are. They're teenagers also. They're growing from one stage to another. And that is transmitted to you just through your retina, as it were, almost immediately. And it seemed to me exemplary in that way.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, that's the canvas.
That's the theatre review we want.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's
Read someday.
What do you find? Do you think, we were talking a little bit this before we came out as well, some of the challenges when it comes to writing about design, and maybe it's to do with probably the majority of theatre reviewers coming from an English literature background as opposed to design background. Do you read reviews of your own work? Is that something you do? You do.
I mean, I certainly did. I mean, I knew when I started out, it was always exciting to get a review, and for me, it was always sort of validation, because I'm terrible at actually thinking that any of my own work is any good. So actually having it there in print and going, oh, this works and it's effective, was always very exciting. And I think there is a currency in it. I mean, I certainly do put reviews on my website alongside my work when I feel that they've, quite neatly described. It's not just if they've been glowing about the design, but actually illuminating something about the design and its context within a production. Because obviously, when looking at the website, you're looking at photographs. It might look very beautiful, but its actual effectiveness as part of the performance is entirely down to watching it live and seeing how it is interacted with and how it's used. So to have something that is eloquently written and contextualizes that is a real help to allow someone who might not have seen the production to put it in its context. But I certainly think that it does have it does have a certain currency to it. And I think it's one of the things I've been talking about with designers, why people are always so keen to say, if you actually really like design, maybe getting a name check and those sorts of things is always really, it can be a tiny thing, but for someone who's literally just graduated and it's for their first production, it can be a huge boost to a boost to the ego and a boost to the career as well. So yeah, I do look at reviews, and you have, I take the negative with the positive as well. It's not all about which one's good or bad per se. It's all illuminating in terms of how audiences are viewing the piece.
I mean, I make a personal thing to always reference designers and movement directors as two people in the theatre sort of bubble who always tend to just not even be named, especially by name. And when they are, they always seem so grateful, and it feels ridiculous to me that this isn't common. So usually my weird quirk, when I go in to see a play, I like to sit in early and just look and just see what is there in front of me if I can, and try. And in my reviews, I always maybe now if you read them you'll notice, but I always try and mention the designer before the director, and I usually try and mention, or I leave the designer to last as like the big thing, and that's just something I started doing and now keep going, because for me design is. So we were talking just a few minutes ago about when in my head, the first play I saw isn't actually the first play I saw. I found my old theatre tickets from 10 years ago when I was a teenager. And the first play I saw, I can't even remember it actually, because I don't think it looked very good. But the second one I saw, which for years has been part of my mythology, that this is the first play I saw, it wasn't. Yeah. It was at the National, it was Oedipus. And it's funny, I was looking just now on my phone to see who the designer was, but the 3 first reviews didn't mention whoever it was. So I don't know who the designer of this is.
Paul Brown.
Oh, Paul Brown, you found it. Yeah.
Yay. You win a biscuit.
When I was 18 and I had never been to a theatre before, really, and to go to the Olivier and to see a set that's completely bare with a bench and a giant door, it just blew my mind. And that was always, and even now, the things that I tend to love tend to be space, and tend to be things with a lot of space and vastness. And all it did, that door, it just rotated at the same speed throughout the whole 3 hours. And I loved it. And I can remember exactly what it looked like. I can remember the colour. I can remember what the floor was like. I can remember how many people were on the set.
That's the thing that stayed for you, the vision. It's amazing what you're saying, then, that so many reviews don't mention the set at all, or occasionally you'll get that thing where it's just 2 lines in the middle of the review, where, simple and striking. Why is that burn? Why is there a reason for this hesitancy for writing about design then?
I I think it might be because I think sometimes people are, I suppose we talked earlier about there's this sort of language game that's going on, that we're coming from a very sort of literary based sort of critical review, and I think there's always that feeling that, you know, I know lots of friends who go into art galleries and they're asked to call upon their sort of visual critical faculties, and it's intimidating because it's not something that we often sort of have a dialogue about, yet we're on our phones every day, and I think probably the next generation of theatre are probably more visually aware than a previous generation. So there's a probably disconnect there between the people who are seeing theatre and people who are writing about it, and where those dialogues are sort of intersecting sort of in terms of that. And I think that's probably why they're hesitant about it. I also think that, as Max said, it's cross-disciplinary. Like the last review I had that I loved mentioned me and the movement director in the same sentence, which for me is like the golden ticket, because I was like, we stood outside in the car park and we worked that out by throwing stuff up in the air. And that's how that piece was generated. So no reviewer would ever sort of, you know, I imagine you have to correct me, that you think that you go in and what you see is what you attribute to the designer, but the designer's discipline, sort of the more collaborative we become as sort of theatre creatives, is that we sort of we take in notes from a choreographer, or we'll listen to tracks and they'll speak to us in a different way, and we have a very artistic kind of subjective response to these things. And because it's more holistic and it's more sort of like permeable into other people's areas, that I think that how do you encapsulate that? If you've seen an amazing sort of aesthetic that's got an amazing piece of choreography, but actually if you took either of those apart, they wouldn't have the same impact. I think that's tricky, and I think that we should sort of encourage people in their reviewing and their writing and their sort of, you know, black and white printed text about it to be experimental in the way they describe it, because it's subjective and it's essentially about whether you've had a response to that storytelling. And I think that's to be encouraged, and to break down those boundaries. It's kind of like how we get those more sort of I find those critical reviews like much more telling about my work. It's much more about an emotional world that I'm creating rather than a visual one. But obviously, I'm still responsible for that. As you said, when the curtain goes up or you walk through the door, that's the canvas, that's the door that's opened you into the world. So it's so nuanced. But I think that's tricky to write down, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's just that we're all idiots, as it were.
No,
visual idiots. You know, I mean, I think the crucial thing is what you said. Actually, no. I think the crucial thing is what you were saying, is that there's probably actually a genuine generational divide now. I mean, which you can see. I mean, since Tate Modern, as it were, which has sort of changed everything. Okay. I think that certainly. Well, I had a literary formation. Nearly every theatre critic I know had a literary formation, and the difficulty is that the reviews tend to be as if that somehow the drama was something that actually inadvertently blundered into a piece of text which would otherwise be completely seamless, and here it is awkwardly walking around the place and taking a sort of incarnated form. Now my thing, I think actually, this is not to say that I do it successfully. It's very rare for me not to mention design and things. I've just written a review where I haven't mentioned the design, and I was acutely conscious of it. Part of the it was of Debbie Tucker Green's play, if anybody's interested. Not because the design wasn't interesting. Well, actually, I mentioned the lighting design. Come to think of it, actually. But there is, by the way, there is a practical difficulty. If you're, like me, compelled to review, which I don't always want to, I would sometimes like to have the liberation that the art critic or other disciplines have of just reviewing one piece. But if you are compelled to review several pieces, you have at the most sort of 4, sometimes 500 words. It's quite difficult to mention too many names without it just looking as if you're name ticking. And so sometimes you just have to sort of arbitrarily jump. But I was also very interested in what you were both saying about this holistic thing, because I'm afraid the dreaded Evening Standard Awards comes into this here. This is what is saying, that the question of, when I was thinking about this beforehand, the word design, what does it mean? Well, I mean, one of the things, of course, it means that it has designs on you. That's a subsidiary point. But why do we always think it's visual? I remember there was one category on that award, on those ceremonies, for design. And one year, I can tell you what it was for, it was Rufus Norris's Feston at the Almeida. A lot of people in this room were probably practically in their nappies when it was on, but you know, it was a marvellous piece. Had a fantastic sound design by Michael Arditi. And I said, could we give the award to Michael Arditi? And my colleague said, no, I'm sorry, look, you've got it wrong, it's for design. So I said, yes, Michael Arditi, design. No, a man, of course. No, you've got it wrong. It's for design. So I said, yes, sound design. Now, I mean, I won in as much as they eventually agreed to give it every person who could have design as part of their adjectival preface. In other words, it had to go to the scene designer, the lighting designer, and so on. I think it's an interesting question about what we are talking about, and of course it's very, very difficult for somebody who isn't a practitioner to separate, as you were saying rightly, separate out the particular effects. But we also need to look at it in a very kind of scrutinising way, I think.
I think going about trying to separate it might sort of almost be sort of counterproductive.
Yeah.
I think it's about a sort of an acceptance that it is sort of a cross. It's an art, you know. I mean, to not sound too sort of pretentious, but it's an instinctual artistic process sometimes, and I find it difficult when I look back how I got to the place that I ended up, and you realise that it's as much about a film that you both saw or a gallery that you happen to both see the same, you know, and how do you know, that's what's beautiful about it, but I think presents a bit of a challenge when maybe you're trying to distill it into sort of a critical review, but I think that's what's so exciting about it. That's what I love anyway.
I do think this idea of emotion is really important to talk about, because I think, when you look at critics and the backgrounds that so many of us come from, ended up actually doing English literature, but this was sort of when I was older, and for me theatre has always been a very emotion-based thing, and I feel like my reviews are often maybe too seeped in emotion, and I try and not be too embarrassed by that, because I know a lot of that tends from being young or being female, and these things that emotions are attributed to. But when I talk to the kids that I work with, I do lots of drama workshops and stuff with teenagers, the first thing they always talk about is design. If you ask them what happened in that play, they say there were this many people. That's usually the first thing, because they know that's right. And they want to talk about what they know isn't wrong. And then they say, okay, there were 4 people, 2 people, whatever, and they played this song and I liked it. Or the lights were really bright, or the lights were really dark, or there was fog. You know, it was really big, or it was really small, and that's where they go. And maybe after 10 minutes they'll be like, oh, and also the language, like at this point they argued, and at this point they didn't. And I try and make sure that when I write my reviews, I think of, would you get something out of this? Would they understand what I'm talking about? And I always find it really interesting how many reviews don't even mention what things look like, what things sound like. It just seems really strange to me, because when I read it, I don't understand what's happening. And it's funny, with the Debbie Tucker Green with If I that I saw a couple of nights ago, I really loved the design. It was very simple, so it's the sort of thing I really like. But it's this big sort of square block and lots of fog, and I just felt so compressed in the Royal Court and so sick as time went on. And I wasn't writing about it, but I try and write notes about everything I see just to keep my mind sort of working. And I went home and I was like, I felt so nauseous. But was it just because of the language, or was it also because of, you know, and then I was like, oh, the sound. I sort of forgot the sound because it was so good, but it was brilliant. It was this booming sort of thing every few minutes. And I was like, oh, if I don't remember something, but I know I had this really emotional reaction, it's probably because one of the designers or all of the designers were really great. And I think that's why a lot of them aren't mentioned, because I don't tend to notice. I think it's easier to notice very bad design than it is to notice very good design.
And that's a really key thing.
Yeah,
there.
the times when I've really like not got it, I'm like, oh, it's because I think the set looks really strange or the music is really annoying me. But when it's brilliant, I'm so in it, I'm not really thinking about, the sound is good.
And the effects are very subtle in them. And when I said I didn't mention the design, I didn't actually mention the physical apparatus, but the lighting was actually crucial in that play. And it did such an interesting thing because that mist at the beginning, which actually made you feel there was a multitude of people on stage. It's a big cast, but I think it's about 19. It made you feel there were about 90.
Yeah.
And then to go from that, which made you announce a sort of universal place, to then this very precise limit of each person by this line of light was really wonderful. Anyway, I certainly agree about the bad design thing as well.
It's an interesting thing saying you don't notice good design, because there's this sort of old adage, isn't it, that back in the day the idea of good design was design you didn't see. There's that old thing of people going, oh, you don't leave humming the scenery and things like, well, no, you do actually, because that's the thing you remember, that's the evocative experience of that's emotional. We seem to be moving into a much more visually led theatre, which is, I think, very exciting, and why we have to develop a new language to be able to talk about it. Something I do really want to ask though is, something Susannah said, to just pick up on, you said a man said it. Our criticism is still very male, and it is still very white. And although we've got things like Critics of Colour, that's amazing and it's changing it, our designers are still quite middle class and white as well. And I'm wondering, is there anything here of, if we have a limited amount of people talking about design, does that feed into a limited amount of people who feel they can get to do the design as well?
Yes. Sorry.
Done.
But sorry, I didn't know what a design. I didn't know, despite loving, like, it took maybe a year or two going to the theatre really regularly before I even knew what a designer was.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't.
Exactly, yeah.
I knew. You know, I was doing this program at the National Theatre. I was a teenager, and it completely was amazing for me. And we met all these amazing people, but I didn't. And I got directors, sort of. They were in charge. Actors were on the stage. And I didn't understand it. I didn't know what I mean, if you see sound design, you have a guess. But years, I had no idea. And the vast majority of people, especially young people, especially people who aren't middle class, who aren't going to theatres with their parents, will have absolutely no idea what a movement director does, or a sound designer, or a lighting designer. Like, you could tell me they switch on the lights and I'd be like, fine, let's go.
Do you feel that what you do is understood when you read reviews of your work? Do you feel that there's a disconnect there, or?
I feel like it's getting better.
There's a lot of really. I mean, I was looking through a few different bits and pieces before this as well. I think actually I found a huge amount where there are some writers and many critics who really do actually make very strong attempts to get under the skin of that. What, not just what the design is, but what it's about and its effect and what have you. And I think, I know for me, I went on Facebook and Twitter for this saying, what do you guys think about this? And where there are gripes and groans about the way that critics talk about design, that can sometimes be put into the idea of people who are maybe less experienced critics maybe, or less experienced with how to discuss design that way. I mean, I think there's probably a whole panel discussion we could have about simple but effective. And I promised that I would say that to some people, because I think that what we're saying is simple actually isn't simple. If it seems simple, it's done its job, but it's actually a huge amount of complexity going on underneath that. But yeah, one of the things about SBTD is about this exposure as well, and the processes and what it is that designers actually do, and be able to spread that to a wider audience. So yeah, critics have been key now, because my favourite critics are also brilliant essayists and write fantastic things about all sorts of aspects of theatre. So it's real education in and of itself.
I think I sort of like really taken by what you said about sort of, if you can't see it, you can't be it. That's the vibe with kind of like a lot of these roles within theatre. And I'm the same as you. I was at art school doing sculpture, and I went to see a show, and it suddenly dawned on me that someone was in charge of how it looked. I had no idea. I really had no idea. It was a total revelation. I was like, I've got to do this. But it is really. I was at art school, but like it takes to be kind of like, I managed to get there, and that takes a certain like going to university, got there, that thing. And I think that you've got to think about the audience and the people who are doing it. And I sort of I sometimes think the critics, I don't know, actually I don't want to be the critics, but there's a socio-economic kind of like world there that is, we're trying to make theatre more accessible, I certainly am kind of like working in that vein, and I do feel like critiques and reviews, like the more accessible they are, I think it says a lot about the audience. It's like this big sort of like interdependent kind of like balancing act, isn't it? Where I want to see like my frame of reference as a designer is like my world, like kind of like all the aesthetic influences I've had, but that's like particular to me and my sort of like context and background. But I think that there is like such an untapped visual kind of dialogue that we're not in, that is like a different audience, and I think that audience aren't seeing their visual world on stage, and I think that's because maybe it's not valued traditionally through like criticism. Like there's that thing of like, you know, there's a whole value system attributed to aesthetics that kind of gets caught up in reviews as well, and I'm sort of guilty of it. You have an instinct that you're like, no, but like, you know, the refined and sometimes it's difficult because that is all linked up with class and education and background. And I think to have more access as a designer, you maybe need a sort of wider spectrum of sort of critical sort of valuation and like respect. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of very interdependent, but there's a sticking point here where it's all about accessibility. Like, you know, I'm really hyper aware of that as a designer, and it feels like we need to open up that visual language so it isn't so rarefied, and be sort of generous towards it as well, and not maybe use the same analysis against it. Maybe give it a bit of space.
I think there's maybe another problem from a critic's point of view. I don't know how much this squares with what you're saying, but which is that, I mean, what's the purpose of writing criticism anyway? If you actually think that the main thing is to, as it were, blast it or give it a tick, then it seems, well, that isn't my view of it. And I think actually the bane of theatre criticism is the adjective, you know, because it very often tells you nothing. I mean, your simple effective is one thing. It's very hard to avoid it when you're writing very, very tightly. But very often that's an evasion of actually a proper response to the piece. Sometimes the proper response to work is not to say, this is fantastic, but to actually simply describe what you see. And in describing what you see, you discover more, of course, about what you think. But you do one important thing, which is give the tool to the reader to assess whether what you then subsequently say about it is actually what they're going to agree with or not. I mean, it's all very well my saying, you know, I think this was sort of misogynist drivel, as it were. Mm-hmm. Well, there might be some misogynists out there who are going to love it. Yeah.
So, yeah. It's brilliant. I will say, for critics of colour, we do these writing about theatre 101 workshops, and it just is answering loads of questions that I had and didn't know when I first started writing. That, you know, start as basic as, this is what a director does, this is what an actor tends to do, this is how much power in the room X and Y and whatever has. And I sent like an email to one person and they sent it to a few people and asked just for tips, and I got, you know, lots of like the same stuff. One of the best things I got was from Marianne Caswain, who I think is Broadway World, and she said a 1-star review should still persuade someone out there that this show is for them, and a 5-star review should still be able to tell someone that this show isn't for them.
Good.
And I keep that. It's good, isn't it? Yeah. And I think about it all the time, where I'm like, yeah, this is a 5-star show. I absolutely loved it, but like, my mum wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't, and that's sort of okay. And to say, you know, and I try and read reviews, wondering if that applies, and a lot of them don't, and I really think maybe this should just be the rule, where, and I try and keep it in my head every time I'm writing, like, could this still, especially like the 3-star review, which is always everyone's like sort of most and least favourite, where it's like, but I still want a 3-star review to get someone and say, oh, this is something I'm really gonna love actually, and this is 3 stars for me, which to some people is good and to some people is bad. Yeah, it's a funny one, but it's difficult, isn't it, I think? And a lot of time with design, the designer gets what is one of the last on the list, and that is always, yeah, I can imagine, really frustrating and really difficult.
Oh, the 3-star review thing, actually. I mean, I have a slightly different attitude from sometimes. I know it's supposed to be terribly bad to give something 3 stars if you haven't made up your mind, but actually it might just genuinely be that you're ambiguous or ambivalent about something in the way that you are about, as it were, people that you meet. And I actually think that the best sort of theatre criticism, and this certainly applies to design criticism as well, is actually precisely engaging on that human level. And it's saying, actually, just let me tell you about this encounter that I had.
Yeah.
And it's this. And actually, the design was wonderful or whatever. And this bit was, the words were terrible, you know. And so actually telling the thing about the invidiousness of the 3-star review is that it implies that it's really bad to tell the truth. And the truth is a complicated thing. And some of the truth is more often 3 stars than, you know, other way. And people should attend to that. I mean, it's also, I hate the star system anyway, because, I mean, of course, people don't read, they just count, you know.
Yeah. So I will say, if I talk about a designer for half the review, it's probably because I feel bad talking about how much I hated something else. I got an email from a designer being like, thank you, and I was like, I don't know if this must have not been obvious how much I hated everything else. The design was absolutely brilliant, and sometimes, I don't know, I'm easily, even in the last year, some of the best things I've seen. I nearly went to see a show in Edinburgh again because I loved the design so much, even though I really didn't care about the show, but I just thought there was nothing. It was a big circle and a picture on the wall and a toy car, and it was the whole design. It was in Cardiff, I can't remember what it's called now, but that was it. And they were just moving around like these sumo wrestlers, and it just got me. And they're arguing, and the arguing gets a bit much after a while, but I loved it. I thought it just worked so well, and I was like, can I go and sit through an hour and a half of something I don't like for the design? In the end, I didn't have the time, but I nearly did.
But did the design kind of like persuade you that you liked it more, or was it?
Yes, definitely. It definitely did.
I feel like that's kind of our responsibility
did.
sometimes.
It definitely did.
Sometimes you know you've got a bit of a plum kind of, and you need to kind of like, okay, how can we sort of like get that bit?
Is that a situation you've been in where you're like, you know, this show is not what we thought it was going to be, but can I get something out with it from the design? Do you think you can elevate?
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite that cynical, but I think it is sort of like, what's working here? How can I support that? How can I maybe get that to sort of resonate a bit more, so that the moments where it's what they're trying to say isn't translating is kind of supported, I suppose. But yeah, there are times where you're like, 40 minutes in, that's really dropping. We're going to have to like, do you know what I mean? Like, get, you know, and that's part of, I mean, that's the sort of, that's the mechanics of design. Sometimes you sort of, you know, there's the how it looks, and there's like, what we all forget is like how if you see a photograph, that's a sort of static image, but what I think really works well, and is why I'm so excited about like you including movement directors, is how a design works in a period of time. You know, it works spatially, but it also works sort of like temporally. Like you've got to, you know, and whether it's a static thing that creates a canvas or a concept for stuff to play out upon, or whether it's something that is crafted, as you said, that door that moved around, there, I'm sure there would have been a moment when that door was leaning out over the audience, and that is like, that's the moment where something's going to land. And it's also the ability, which is even more difficult to describe unless you've got something, you know, like Streetcar Named Desire, the young Vic, that was very much about time and talked about that. You're not just designing a picture and how it looks, you're also supporting the arc of the storytelling.
Sorry.
Oh no, I just think as well that in relation to that, because I find that like when you're saying about the design supporting the production, it's rare for me to design a show, and if there's something fundamentally wrong with the structure of the piece itself, I'm there thinking something's not working with the entire piece, and I'm thinking, what is it that's not working with the design as well? And it photographically might look beautiful, and you can't find something fault. And after a while, I realised, it's because the piece as a piece of life work isn't necessarily working, and you're trying to find ways to engage that. Conversely, the shows that I've really loved, where the writing itself is completely electric and is so on fire, I felt so satisfied with the most lightweight designs I've ever done, where it's just a piece of carpet and a couple of chairs, because the text is so interesting and is so brilliant. The whole show seems brilliant just by the fact that I've sort of held back a little bit, and I've gone, great, everything worked together really perfectly. I wasn't trying to overshadow anything.
Yeah, you can do designs that really. I've done designs that sat there statically for 90 minutes, and then the last 2 seconds are the moment where you're just like, and do you know what I mean? So that's a choice.
But I think sometimes they can. I mean, I can think of one example of. Sorry.
No.
Of a design that actually changed my mind about the composer of the piece. I mean, there are many designs. Slightly to the side, I was thinking actually one of my best designs was Tim Hatley's design for Ghosts at the Almeida, where as soon as you went in, something about the piece transmitted itself, because there were these extraordinary series of transparent screens. You knew that something was going to loom out. It wasn't a haunting, it was much more subtle than that. It was partly seeing through, partly something coming up from behind. That's an example to me where you're wired straight into the centre of the piece. But what I was thinking about was something that actually happened at the Donmar, which was that I went as a Sondheim skeptic to see Michael Grandage's production of Merrily We Roll Along, which is a famously difficult piece, and it's got sort of too much going on, and the bits don't quite fit together, and how's it all going to work, and is it going to be complicated, and is it real or not real, all these things. And Christopher Oram, in my view, a marvellous designer, it was don't have your complete visual memory, but my memory of it was almost like a sort of a brown rolling wave in the background, rather statuesque but enabling. It hardly changed, but what actually happened is, as the action shifted and the lighting shifted a bit, you suddenly had the feeling that the articulation of the piece was quite different, that the point about the piece was this mixture of different emotions, which didn't normally quite go together, but actually suddenly did go together, that the time switches and the difficulties of the plotting could be made seamless. In other words, that the title had a point. Now, I'm sure Michael Grandage had a lot to do with that as well, but there was absolutely no doubt to me that the simplicity, to use that overused word, but the apparent left aloneness of the design, and the fact that it actually made one seem to blend effortlessly into the next was utterly crucial, and it came away making me feel, yes, actually, they're right about Sondheim. I was wrong, But it did change my mind about it. It wasn't just a visual thing, So
And that's really interesting, because that feels like it's that they've created a sort of a structure, that canvas that has supported that particular peculiarity of a piece of work. And I think that's sort of sometimes the choice you get to make as a designer. When critics sort of, when an audience gets that, that's sort of like deeply rewarding, because it's not about a picture you've made, or it's about really getting into the bones of the work and letting it tell its story.
Yes.
Yeah. I think, and one of the reasons I actually like theatre criticism, amongst other reasons where I find it more difficult, is finding poetry in it, and as I'm a poet as well, and usually when I look at design, I find it easiest to ask myself, what do I feel because of this, and what is it trying to make me feel, and how is it moving? I always ask myself, does that make sense? And what does it look like? Which sounds really silly, but some of whose review was it? I can't remember whose review it was, for The Brothers' Size at the Young Vic, which I really loved, and I wrote my glowing review. But someone mentioned the actors moving around like a panthers in an enclosure, and I got that. And I wonder why there isn't. And I think there's
visual language.
Visual language.
You're using a visual language to thing.
I'd argue it's more because of the critics who mostly are speaking, and this visual language is often feminized and or seen as a feminized thing, and it's seen as a young thing, and it's something I really enjoy, and it's something that I feel that most people reading, who I want to read theatre reviews, actually, big distinction, understand, and things like that. It's like I get exactly what he's talking about when he says that. And so when I try and look at reviews, I'm like, what does it actually look like? Does it look like a boat? Does it remind me of a ship? Does it remind me of London, even if it's nothing to do with any of those things? And I feel like when I'm reading reviews and not really understanding what's going on the stage, it's because they're not telling me that. They're not telling me, what does this remind you of? What does this look like?
So in terms of that visual language and poetry, I'd like to see if we've got any poetic questions in the audience. Don't necessarily have to be poetic. Any questions for our amazing panel?
Yeah, I was curious if you thought there's a potential for a different form of criticism. So we talked about using words, but maybe a visual form of criticism, so whether that's through photography or film, would be a way to approach design, because it moves halfway. I mean, I don't know whether anyone's got any, I come from outside of theatre, so I don't know whether that does exist, but just struck me as a potential way to bridge something like that.
It doesn't, or there isn't really, and I'm really inept when it comes to things like the internet, but I find it really fascinating that no one's gone out and done like a YouTube channel or something just for theatre criticism. That hasn't happened, and with Critics of Colour we're sort of gone silent for a bit. But one of the things we're doing in the year, hopefully, don't know, it's being recorded, it's fine, is trying to get stuff on the internet in videos so that people can even just be outside a theatre and say immediately, like, this is what this looked like, or here's a picture, this is what I saw, and actually here are the press pictures, but weirdly, you know, they didn't show, you know, they obviously don't show the big reveal at the end when the set goes back in the middle of like Julie at the National, you know, those big sort of reveals, and they're not often in the press pics, obviously, for the surprise. So yeah, I hope people do that, and if anyone wants to do that, please just do that and invite me to, I don't know, subscribe. But yeah, visual and also audio, like there are some podcasts now, but not enough, I think, not as many compared to things like fashion industry or other industries. There aren't as many podcasts or talk
stage
shows.
has one, doesn't there? There's
and
starting,
stage
but it's
shows
still
doing
an
this stuff.
underexploited medium, I'd say.
Sounds a great idea to me. I mean, but I'm interested also what you were saying about the YouTube, just in terms of also the other thing that's little discussed. It's not a design question, but just to the side, because there's so many things that aren't discussed in criticism, is actually the quality of voice. Hardly ever mentioned, you know. It is tremendously important, you know. I mean, people tend to analyse a performance in terms of sort of intent and characterisation, but there are other attributes as well. Anyway, that's
critics, you mean?
Critics,
oh,
yes,
yeah.
yeah.
For the shows. Yeah, no, completely.
Yeah.
It is hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
With Critics of Colour, we really, I don't know, I've been really struggling with working out where my editor voice comes from, where I'm editing people, but I'm also like, am I editing them into a norm that actually we should be fighting against? Because if all the reviews I've ever read are speaking with a similar-ish voice, should I be editing people's work to fit that voice? Or should I be saying, actually, maybe their work should be rebelling against that voice because I want people like that to be going to the theatre more than I care about the critics who are already at the theatre? The answer is I don't have one, so I haven't been editing people's work at all, beyond typos. But it is a struggle, I think, and one that I hope the theatre critic industry, and maybe not proved, but we've been really welcomed. People are willing, I think, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people are willing to see change and active in wanting to see that change.
I think there's also, just to sort of say, I think you kind of put your finger on something, and I've noticed recently that, like, before we used to release like a couple of prize images of the production that we wanted to be out there on the top of the review, and now you get like slideshows. Like, lots of reviews recently have like a series of images from the show. So I think there is kind of like a bit of a hunger for a more kind of like a sort of visual kind of immediacy to kind of see the vibe of what you're getting before you like spend the money on the ticket, really. But I sometimes think that that's kind of misleading, because the point of what we do is about time and narrative, and so I sort of am with you in that it's really useful, but also like the point is that you're in the space with those people, so it's like it's tricky. And there are people like Front Row do kind of like, they obviously it's on the radio, so they often sort of like record actors. But like when you've worked on a show and you hear the thing on the radio, and then you're like, that is like not what happens in the play. Like it's always bad, and it sounds like
it's very difficult to take it out of context,
Yeah.
even the photographs and thing, and then once you've got the photographs, well, you've got the whole other argument, which we probably don't have time to rant about now, of image crediting, that is such a problem in our industry as well, that you can't credit everybody because otherwise it gets full. But then who on earth do you leave off to make it fair? Any more questions?
On the point of design being like the entry point towards, sort of a lot of your first entry points towards the show as a whole, but not necessarily added in the sort of contextual information that you get in the program or in websites or in even reviews about that kind of idea. Do you think there might be a benefit to having designers peel back the curtain, so to speak, a little bit about that process and some of the thinking that goes before an audience is seeing a piece of work, or do you think the kind of visual spoiler is too strong?
I think I've found that opinions are split on the issue, and I've certainly worked with designers who are very happy to expose all of their work and the full design long before the show goes into production. And there sometimes seems to be you're unsure if there's a stigma or something that I should reveal what the show's going to look like before we go into rehearsals and what have you. And those opportunities are there are wide now because everyone's got Twitter and Instagram, all these different things. In terms of the choices that then venues are making, when we did the Value of Design event on Wednesday, I spoke with one artistic director who said of a big local theatre who said, I don't want to expose the process behind it. I want the audience to just come and see the thing that we want to present them, and I'm not interested in that. But there was a concession that information maybe should be there for anyone who particularly wants to find it, and with online platforms that the opportunities are exponential. You can find all sorts of places where we can put that information. But I don't know whether that's going to come from designers themselves finding that platform, or whether it's going to be coming from, whether it's from criticism or from papers or from magazines or from the venues, and that's the discussion that we're having.
I think out of context, pictures and I just think they're so intrinsically linked with the writing, the actors, that I personally don't release images prior. I sometimes do, like, I use sort of like Instagram and stuff, but it's not. I don't want my work to be seen independently. I want it to be seen as part of the thing. So I don't. But a lot of theatres are very interested in the kind of what I was saying about the accessibility thing. Is they're much more happy to be transparent about the process. I do a lot of lots of theatres now do blogs, so they ask for a bit of like background on, and maybe I quite often give them my reference images. So when we start off, and I'm like doing a show at the moment, and like I'm really stuck on a Guardian expose of like the ICE detention centres on the Mexican border. Like I can't get it out of my head, and they're like, and that's the kind of the first image I showed the theatre when I go in. I'm like, this is where it's come from because I'm stuck in this, and that's what we're building our world out of. They're more interested in that because that kind of opens up our process more rather than the finished picture, which I personally hate production photos. I just think that's not the point. So
yes, I'm with you from the critic's point of view. I mean, I would rather see the complete thing. I'd love to know something about the process afterwards, and then it becomes a critical tool. But I mean, it's like all pre-exposures. I mean, it's like talking to an actor or a writer before the show. What you then have in your mind is the intent when you go into the show. And so you are constantly either arguing with the production, which isn't fulfilling the intent, or you're eagerly looking for the intent and judging that. What you're not seeing is the complete production. And I think that is certainly what I want to see. And then intricately peel it to pieces, and then I would very much like, to hear from people what they tell.
I mean, sort of behind. I think it's probably. I would find it more interesting to do behind the scenes after I've seen it. Obviously, that's not how theatres sell tickets. So there's always this sort of.
But it should be.
It should be, exactly,
but it should be.
Yeah.
My favourite article I've ever done was my Guardian editor is really lovely, Chris, and he occasionally I have a weird idea and he'll let me run with it. And I went to the Michelle Terry's first season, and she did the 2-parter, and this idea of a collaborative process, and depending on the reviews were sort of middling to good, so how well that worked I don't know, but for me to go behind the scenes and to try and unpick that, and my most interesting chats were with the designer Ellen Parry, who was brilliant, and in the part of the collaborative process they were doing at the Globe was, unlike the designer just getting there and deciding with the director, was the actors, which obviously for Ellen was awful because it's like you had so much less time, just you had to, not awful, actually they really liked it, they thought it was a really interesting process. But in the piece there's a really great quote from them where it's like at first I was like, I'm not going to get all this lead up time, I'm just going to have to go in and talk. But for me, as a writer, writing about this, not as a critic necessarily, but as someone presenting this, it was just fascinating because I didn't know how it worked, the process, really. And for the, it was a really well-read piece, and I think people were interested in that. And in the programme, the biggest part of the programme, unlike normally going to the most famous actor, went to Ellen's designs and their early sketches. And I think that's brilliant. And I don't know why more theatres don't do that, why more theatres don't, programmes, or even, and putting them online as well, they can be accessible to everyone. For me, like another interview with an actor when they've been interviewed in newspapers and magazines isn't something you should be putting in the programme. or even with what the director thinks. I don't personally, that isn't something I really want in a program. What I think I'd want in a program is the designer being like, actually, if you've seen this piece, now this is what I wanted to do, and here are some of my sketches, and here are some of my photos, and here is the process behind it. And of everyone involved in the play, that's the person I think who should be getting that space.
Do you think that site-specific work has had a big effect on the way? Because I certainly think it has. I mean, I remember being tremendously sort of excited with Firebird's Ball, actually, even before Faust was Punch Drunk.
Yeah.
And it just seemed to me to have certainly exposed very nervous critics. They were so funny when they went to Faust and having to put a mask on.
Yeah.
And
We've got time for one more from the audience. How we doing? Yeah,
So were you
yeah, a
going to
couple
say?
more.
No, I was just saying. I think that has caused people to think about a visually led experience,
More
and to go with
yes.
and to go with your time thing, which interested me very much. What you were saying about the
I think so.
time evolution,
And I think the whole like accessibility of theatre outside of a space is brilliant, and I think that changed our dialogue. I think that's changed how like
and
critics
the
sort of.
class thing as well.
I think that was really. I think that whole change. I mean, that's kind of like that's how I came in. Like, that's how I started because I sort of felt like I could go and do that, and I felt like that was probably the first time in my career where I was getting reviewed by people. It was being reviewed by different people because a lot of they didn't know what to say, and they weren't. Maybe
They didn't even know about it.
Yeah, they didn't
That was
know
the
about
thing.
it.
I
Like
mean,
the first time I went to Uni Bum Bum Train, the people who were reviewing it were the people that kind of like I was making work with at the time, and I think that's what I just want to say one thing. I think it's really brilliant what you said about the Globe and the backstage stuff that you did with the designer there, is because their whole presentation of theatre changed. Like it's like a different. They were trying to go. We're doing this differently now. And it's not that you're giving away spoilers as a critic, you're just saying, hey, look, there's a different approach here, there's a different sort of mindset in the building, and I think that design's a really accessible way to do that.
Yeah.
So I sort of agree with that when you're like, don't come and expect, and that was so interesting because you had 12th Night, which was very West End audience, and then you had sort of a lot of, you know, I did a show there in that season, and you had Michelle's work, and it was a lot more like robust and immediate. And people really responded to it in a different way because they've got a very traditional audience there. And I think if critics say that this is a whole sea change, then people, as you say, people from that review can make that decision when they want to get that ticket. And that is about getting into the bones and maybe having a dialogue with the designer a bit more about
And
that.
people who don't know much about it, I really, honestly, that programme, I kept it, and I don't keep many programmes because I see so many things, but it was just so interesting to see these beautiful early sketches, and it was an early sketch, then a sketch a few months in, then another one. It just was great.
Actually, just an adjunct to that, it's slightly off the point, but not that off the point. It's very mysterious. We've been talking about design, and you were talking about theatre programmes. Why are they mostly so hideous? I mean, they are
design programmes?
Really, you know, I mean, not absolutely invariably,
No.
but I mean, really, you know, I mean, it's Neanderthal the way they look.
And I don't understand why they're not all put online. I don't think you'd lose that much money.
No.
I think the people who want to buy them
really good.
will buy them,
Yeah,
and the
pay-
people who don't have
Yeah.
money,
Yeah,
you
quite
know,
right, yeah.
will just,
Yeah.
and that's where you're going to get young audience. That's a whole other rant for another day, sorry. But put them online.
How much, if you maybe see a second production of the same piece, maybe with Merrily, you've seen at the Donmar Associate designing it, and then went to saw see Suge Gilmore designing it very differently for the Sonny Freedman production. How much does seeing one design influence another?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think. I think it goes back to this thing about separating the design from the rest of the experience, and so I sort of think I don't. One doesn't particularly influence the other. I mean, I think I would just come away that my immediate feeling always is to see it in its totality, and it's what you're saying about emotion, that actually that's, and then to sort of tease it apart. Often the design will be an absolutely crucial factor in how I respond to it, but I don't think I go in there thinking, oh, I wonder whether it's going to be, you know, much more intricate this time. I never do that.
I think theoretically, if I saw a show that had the exact same creative team and cast, but just the designer was different, then maybe, but
Yeah.
I don't think I have. I think I don't separate the designer as much as I think I do from the rest, because it is that emotion thing, right? And you're so in it or not. It's interesting though. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, I feel like we're just sort of like getting under the surface of this.
Think about that for a while.
It's interesting.
It's not necessarily a question, but one thing I think that like we've got a responsibility to do as, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of set and costume designers in the room, but I don't know how many kind of lighting and sound designers there are, and movement directors indeed, and like how Susannah and Joe, you were sort of talking about the kind of idea that there's the designer on a project, and actually I really, really cringe when people sort of think that the set and costume designer is the designer, because it's absolutely not true. And I think we've just got to keep, because there's a bit of a tradition of like in billing and stuff that you might say it's the designer and then the lighting and wardrobe or sound, and it's a bit awful. And I just think we've got to keep sort of pushing against that as like a little small problem. And
I think that's really right. I mean, I think that sound design is it's started to be mentioned a bit more now, but it's really like some kind of only sister sort of hanging around, you know.
And lighting, I think, as
lighting,
well.
yeah.
I remember your review of White in Edinburgh. It was yours, wasn't it? And that.
Do I need to apologise now? Or
No. The lighting, you mentioned the lighting design, which was brilliant, and obviously it's like, and I can't remember how you phrased it, but you said something like some of the best lighting design at a Fringe show.
Yeah, because the show was in a shipping container.
Yeah,
and I think particularly actually design at the Fringe never gets spoken about.
No.
Yes,
And that's partly because there's no word count, which I understand, but also you have got a lot of sets that don't have the finesse necessarily of something that's in a more permanent venue, because you've got to get it in 10 minutes and back out again. And this design in the shipping container was absolutely one of the best Fringe designs I've ever seen in my life.
And it was so nice leaving that review and doing what I always do, which is Google and read. And I was like, someone saw this, and it was there. And I was like, and in the end I got to do like my 150 word tiny, but I was like, I've got to mention this because it's so great. And they emailed like, thank you. And I was like, oh, it must be so lovely that you. And I just I didn't see that in any other Fringe shows. I didn't see anyone else mention lighting design, and I read a lot of Fringe reviews. I don't know, we can all do better, I think.
We could. Actually, the costume, funny enough, which you'd think is something that would be routinely mentioned, I think isn't mentioned very much, and I think it's because it's considered a bit girly. I mean, I'm just wondering. I mean, I'm speculating. You know, I mean, if I do that, am I just kind of somebody sitting there, talking about frocks all the time, I wonder, because
that's interesting that it's the frocks that would get the it's tricky, isn't it?
I'm speculating. I mean, I don't really know, but it hadn't occurred to me until that question was raised, because you'd think it was kind of there all the time.
When I asked this on Twitter, Katie Sykes, who's a brilliant costume designer, said that she finds that often costume is sort of ranked lower than set and does nothing to help the exposure, but also the pay gap. And that it's not seen in an equal way, and actually just having those things given equal billing in a fixed program or in a review really helps to actually boost those conversations.
Fight design as well. There's one that's hardly ever mentioned. Fight.
The only time design set or costume specifically is mentioned, especially in Fringe stuff, I was noticing it was always when it was something modern and there was something, they wanted to say something and didn't have the words for it. So you mentioned that the young black guy is in a hoodie and that's it. Or you mentioned the brown girl's in a hijab. And I just thought, come on guys, I know we've got a little word count, but what we do, if this is the only time where ever, in all of these reviews I'm reading at Fringe, the only time the costume design is mentioned is because you want to talk about what you think about this performer and the identity, but you don't have the words. It's just so lazy, and it irritates, and if it irritates me a bit, it must irritate you guys so much more.
You're right.
I mean,
It's easy to do
I
that.
think in a way, because like the costume is very immediate to the character, and I think that that's sort of like the immediacy is there. And I would sort of maybe suggest that sort of, and lots of, it depends what role the costume's playing in the piece, but and often the set designer does the costume as well. But I think that I would suggest that particularly the way that directors are working now is that the design and the aesthetic, we work we come on board in a process a lot earlier sometimes. Or not if you're doing a musical, it sounds already there, do you know what I mean, the music, but I think it's got something to do with the generation of the work as well. I think it's across, as I said, it's all permeable, but I think the reason quite often is like the generation of the concept is very often a designer director kind of initiation maybe, and then that's why, like, I think there might be
quite hierarchical.
yeah, I mean maybe it's sort of like a time-based, yeah, I mean, yes.
I hope that we can, because relating some of the things that we were asked earlier to that as well, because we were talking about like online platforms and visual mediums where you can actually use videos and see lighting, see sound, and experience things you wouldn't get just in the written word. Those opportunities will increase exponentially, and we should be talking about lighting and sound and all the things that people don't normally get to see. And in terms of exposure, yes, there's an idea of not exposing the person behind the curtain, and some organisations want to come to it fresh, but having the opportunity for people to find that if they want, apart from anything else, to be able to get people who might not be aware that, oh, sound designer is a role, or lighting designer is a role, as much as they don't realise that a set of costume designer is a role. And we, when I did First Encounters tour for RSC, we took that into schools all over the country, and that is literally the first encounter that any of these school kids have had with Shakespeare. And being in like a school hall in Bow with these kids was like they're the most turned on and electric and excited audience I've ever seen. They just completely loved it, and so anything we can do to sort of widen that, I think, is really important.
Oh God, that's so
as
classical.
well.
Thank you
So,
very much.
yeah, well, I think in terms of online, because did everyone see The Encounter that was on BBC iPlayer? And that was like, just a complete revelation. Going, I've seen theatre screened into cinemas and I've seen it on iPlayer, but suddenly thinking, you can actually do something that's unique and theatrical through that sort of medium. Just makes me think suddenly the opportunities there are only just starting. But for the moment, it's just been seen as a print medium on a screen. Yeah. And it's not just a way of increasing word count, it's slideshows, it's videos, it's 3D audio, it's all sorts of things.
And I think you're right, it lends itself to a democracy of accreditation, and I think that like you have a choice. Then I think that the written word, what we're talking about, like the critical review is one thing, but I think that there's probably a responsibility within theatres and platforms to have the online programme and that be linked out. I once saw a piece that was televised, the radicalisation of Bradley. Yeah, brilliant. And there were all these links that popped up in the chat because it was all live, and it was that thing where you could actually kind of. I mean, it was a sort of investigation to sort of, it was based online. But I think we have those platforms, and I think that we shouldn't keep those people hidden. Like I always credit my costume supervisor because they're the people that hold the whole ship together, and they wouldn't necessarily be like reviewed in a printed but I think that we should be able to access those people and their work if possible as well, because it's so vital.
And also you mentioned a few minutes ago musicals. Reviews of musicals tend to mention designers a lot more and tend to talk about what's going on stage, and I wonder why that is. I'm not sure why that is. Just whenever I read a review about a musical, they'll mention what the costume's like, whereas I don't. If I see the word costume, it tends to be in things like musicals, and if I see the word, all of that stuff, and obviously sound design, it's a lot more obvious. And I'm not sure why it is. I actually don't have any clue.
Maybe there's more value given to it in that kind of context.
People aren't nervous about describing a musical as being spectacular in the same way. Whilst there's this sort of spectacular has a dirty image when it comes to theatre. Like if something is, if you're noticing the costume, you're noticing it's very elaborate, that somehow that's taking away from the text or the dramaturgy, when actually that could be exactly what the text of dramaturgy needs in the moment. It was an incredible wig, but in a musical you seem to be able to get away with that a lot more. I'm aware that time is marching on, so have we got time? Tom's shaking his head at me, but time is not marching on. We're totally fine, are we?
I was going to say about the musical thing. I mean, I think it's a kind of literary critical English lit snobbery thing. That actually the content of a piece has to be this, you know, this cut up text thing, you know, that the real content is the text. Well, clearly the real content in the theatre is not just the text. I mean, it's not only the, I mean, it's part of it. Whereas, and that doesn't apply in the musical, because that, on the whole, I mean, unless it's extraordinarily well written or has a great deal of dialogue, or if it's sung through or something, then that isn't there to discuss. So people turn their attention elsewhere. I mean, I think it's kind of partly it's a sort of a practical thing, and they suddenly realise that, well, actually, you know, maybe gesture may be a telling thing. You know?
I wonder if because I sometimes wonder as well if it's approaches to certain texts, because where there are some kind of classic texts or ones where there's a kind of expectation of, well, the design is sort of a key part of the interpretation of the text itself, and this is what we're doing with it. And I've certainly been, you know, I've been in productions where I saw 12th Night at National with Olivier, who was it? Lisa Clacken, and I had an audience member behind me say at the interview, went, "Oh, it's hardly traditional, is it?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" You know, it's like I don't know whether they were saying that like I wish it was, or there's something wrong, or you know, I kind of would almost, I'd rather, you know, not to be just saying you're wrong, but just say what exactly did you mean by that, and what were you expecting, those sorts of things.
It's that huge Shakespearean legacy, the
yes,
domination,
Shakespeare,
and I mean, you get different. I mean, even newspapers send different critics to review different bodies of work, don't they?
That's
so
true.
they're, you know, that's there as much as we, you know, different and those different critics use different languages, and so maybe we don't get a different aesthetic direction approach into that body of work because it's guarded by that language that's being used around it. So, you know, that's why I think like Shakespeare on the Continent is so exciting, because you're sort of, it's sort of suddenly, it's, you know, suddenly harnessing a translation which isn't sort of entrenched in this sort of academic kind of rarefied space.
We're getting a bit of that over here as well, aren't
yeah,
we?
I think so.
I mean, with the Young Vic's 12th Night, for example.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And Robert Icke, I don't know how to say his
I
name.
feel like we've sort of, I'm really excited about what's going on in that world at the moment, and I think it is making it more accessible to a different audience. I mean, I'm certainly feel like I can go and, I mean, I can be in that space now where, like, you know, maybe I wouldn't have felt I could in the past, so it's good. But it helps to have that language, helps for those reviews to speak in those terms, I think. We are done, guys.
Didn't thing to end on of, you know, accessible, and we all find a nice visual language to speak in. Can you join me in thanking our panel? Thanks to Tom and Alice for